The history that Asian Americans have in the United States has never truly been stable, from the early immigrant merchants and sailors that arrived during the early 1800s to the modern-day Americans. Their view in society as an American has always changed, especially during the rise of World War II after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, causing the uprising of the internment of Japanese Americans 2 months later on February 19, 1942, and ended on March 20, 1946, exactly 4 years of wrongful imprisonment of Americans. It should be noted that although 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned, the government had originally only taken in 3,000 suspects, but after social hysteria grew, the government was pressured to make a larger move. It should also be noted that people such as Attorney General Francis Birtle warned others that the establishment of internment camps would be unconstitutional and a violation of human rights. Yet President Roosevelt still signed Executive Order 9066, which justified internment as an act of national security. Prejudice and social hysteria was the major cause for this decision, as the government enforced internment as a safety measure against espionage, but in fact had no correlation with the evidence. The internment camps were located far from major cities. They were old military bases that had harsh living conditions. Families had to live in cramped quarters and were given poor clothing, food, and medical care. Japanese Americans tried to create their own society with schools, police departments, fire departments, and small stores. Along with the internments came a loyalty test that all Japanese Americans took. In this test, there was a section for young, able men to join the war effort, breaking apart these broken families even more. After the war was over, Japanese Americans were released. It wasn't until 1988 that they were formally apologized to by President Reagan. After the war, many Japanese Americans felt betrayed by their own country, but instead of voicing their anger, they worked hard to gain America's trust. The idea of a model minority started to build. There was a rise in highly educated and wealthy Asian Americans. Following the end of this Japanese internment, the US government implemented a number of immigration laws that affected Asian Americans up until the 1970s. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act ended racial exclusion from immigration, allowing Asians to migrate to the US in larger numbers. However, the law still prioritized immigrants from Western European countries, and Asian immigration was limited to a quota of 2,000 people per year. However, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 finally abolished the quota system and allowed more Asians to migrate to the US. This led to an increase in Asian American population, particularly from South Asian countries such as Vietnam and Cambodia, due to the Vietnam War and the genocide in Cambodia. Despite these changes, discrimination against Asian Americans continued, with laws and policies limiting their access to education, employment, and housing. It was not until the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 1970s that the Asian American community began to fight back against these discriminatory practices and demand equal treatment under the law. One significant victory for Asian Americans during this time was the 1974 Lau versus Nichols Supreme Court decision, which ruled that schools were required to provide non-English speaking students with appropriate language assistance. This decision was instrumental in securing educational rights for Asian Americans and other non-native English speakers, as it required schools to provide English language instructions to students who need it. Another significant development during this time was the emergence of Asian American activism and advocacy groups, such as the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund and the Asian American Political Alliance, which fought for greater political representation and social justice for Asian Americans. These groups helped to raise awareness of the discrimination faced by Asian Americans, such as Chol Soo Lee, that created a large movement that pushed for changes in laws and policies to address these issues. The grassroots movements that were present before Chol Soo Lee led to a wider Pan-Asian movement in the 1960s to the 1970s.
Chol Soo Lee was born during the aftermath of the Korean War into a broken family. He was born out of wedlock and was left by his mother, who married an American soldier and fled to the US. In 1964, his mother came back to Korea, and at the age of 12, Chol Soo Lee immigrated to the US. He lived in San Francisco with his mother and was sent to a school that was geared toward Chinese students. At the school, he was often bullied, and in an incident with some other students, he was sent to the principal's office. An altercation with the principal got him sent to juvie. In juvie, Chol Soo Lee acted as if he was going to commit suicide as a means to gain attention, but instead got him sent to a psych ward. In the psych ward, the doctors forced him medication and misdiagnosed him with schizophrenia. He was released 3 months later when the doctors realized he just couldn't speak good English. Even as a young boy, Chol Soo Lee was ousted by the system and given little to no support. The system would cheat Chol Soo Lee again in 1973 when he was misidentified and arrested for the murder of Yip Yi Tak. At the time of his arrest, Chol Soo Lee was 21 years old and living in Chinatown, San Francisco. Yip Yi Tak was shot on the street corner of Chinatown, and 3 out of the 6 eyewitnesses from the scene identified Chol Soo Lee as the killer. However, those eyewitnesses were all white tourists and would have been subjected to cross-race effect, which is the idea that people can easily recognize others in their racial group, meaning that it would be harder for them to accurately identify the suspects because they are from different racial groups. Coincidentally, Chol Soo Lee was arrested prior to the murder due to a suspicious occurrence, to which he accidentally shot off a gun that he had gotten from his manager. The gun was shot off in his apartment and left a bullet hole in his wall. The gun Chol Soo Lee shot off was a .38 caliber and matched the gun from the crime scene. But the barrel configuration of the 2 guns were different, meaning that they were not the same. Following the murder, the authorities detained Chol Soo Lee because he fit the description of a Chinese man, when he was actually Korean. Despite all this, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sent to dual vocational institution in Tracy, California. In 1977, he was caught in a prison altercation which led to the death of Morris Needham, a neo-Nazi. Although Chol Soo Lee was practicing self-defense, he was convicted of double murder and sentenced to death row. Chol Soo Lee's story and the events that led to his conviction raised the attention of K.W. Lee, an investigative journalist. K.W. Lee was interested in Chol Soo Lee's case and had the chance to talk to him in prison. He became very fond of Chol Soo and believed him to be innocent. So, in 1978, he wrote a 2-part investigative article, Lost in a Strange Culture and the Alice in Chinatown Murder Case, for the Sacramento Union.
This young boy was condemned as insane. There were no support system, no counselors, no school teachers, nobody. Absolutely, he was on his own. The criminal justice system had no incentive to really find out, about this boy and his cultural and language background.
K.W. Lee's article not only raised awareness of Chol Soo Lee's case, but of the injustice that many Asian Americans had experienced in the U.S.
And that's why I felt, it was my calling to make some small dent in that war of ignorance and insensitivity.
Ultimately, Chol Soo Lee's case became an outlet for Asian Americans to voice their frustration and anger, and sparked a Pan-Asian movement.
So this notion of a Pan-Asian movement is then an Asian American identity is one that is Pan-Asian, meaning it's not just focusing on one particular ethnic group, right? So that in itself is coalitional. And so the movement, in many ways, it was interracial, but it's also about building solidarity within Asian American communities, because we tend to think of Asian American communities as just a given, right? But there is so much diversity within Asian American communities, right? And so this is also sort of then building solidarities within Asian American communities across all these differences in ethnicity, class, religion, language, and so on.
This movement brought up student activists, elderly immigrants, religious leaders and organizations, business owners, social workers, attorneys, and mass media organizations and professionals in the Bay Area, as well as across the country and across the world in Asian countries such as Korea and Japan. The Asian community would go on to hire Leonard Weinglass to work as a defense attorney for Chol Soo Lee. Later on, Weinglass would have to withdraw from the case, but in his place came J. Tony Serra and Stuart Hanlon, who joined the defense team. Alongside them was a friend of Chol Soo Lee, Renko Yamada, who studied to become a defense attorney after Chol Soo Lee's arrest. In July of 1978, Chol Soo Lee's defense team filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus, which is a legal action that protects incarcerated people from unlawful imprisonment. Chol Soo Lee was granted a retrial, which ended in disappointment as he was found guilty again and sent back to prison. Later on, the defense team would be able to uncover a new eyewitness, Stephen Lau, who was an Asian eyewitness who saw the killer walk away from the crime scene. Due to his background, Lau would not be subjected to the cross-race effect, making him a quality eyewitness. Due to this new evidence, Chol Soo Lee was granted a retrial that started on August 11, 1982. By the help of his defense team, he was acquitted and released from prison on March 28, 1983, after being confined for 10 years. Many people don't know or remember Chol Soo Lee and his story, but his case serves as an example of the court system's failing to bring justice to minorities and Asians such as him. All the evidence was pointing away from Chol Soo Lee being the suspect, and more towards his innocence, yet the authorities and the court chose to ignore it.
A lot of people say I was not an angel on outside. At the same time, I was not the devil. But whatever I was on outside does not justify to frame a person to put him in prison for murder he did not commit. That is no excuse.
Oftentimes, for young people, there's oftentimes when we talk about institutionalized inequalities, it's something that's happened, that's so embedded that leaves us no choice to accept it, right? It sort of becomes that's the way things are. How are we gonna change things? So we feel powerless or paralyzed or even indifferent. Like, what difference is one person gonna be made, right? That it's impossible to make any difference. So it leaves us complacent, particularly around the criminal justice system, where we often bring sort of our preconceptions that these are bad people, right? That they're guilty of crimes. So here, the Chol Soo Lee movement shows the possibilities for young people to get involved, to actually bring about change.
Chol Soo Lee's case greatly impacted the Asian community, as it inspired many young Asian Americans to become social workers, to help fight against future injustice and discrimination, which we still see happening today.
The rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans is not a new thing, as these communities have been subjected to discrimination in the United States for a very long time. The pandemic has only made this issue worse, highlighting the urgent need for greater awareness, education, and action to combat hate crimes and systemic racism against all minority communities. In the early stages of the pandemic, many prominent individuals in government and media were a part of these racist acts towards Asian Americans, contributing to an atmosphere of hate and discrimination. This is what Trump had to say about the pandemic.
What I said the other night, there's never been anything where they have so many names. I could give you 19 or 20 names for that, right? It's got all different names. Wuhan, Kung Flu, yeah. Kung Flu. Some people call it the Chinese flu, the China flu, right? They call it the China as opposed to the China. I never see anything like it, but here's the story. We are going to be stronger than ever before, and it's going to be soon.
The COVID-19 pandemic has led to discrimination amongst 82% of Asian Americans in the U.S. Asian Americans experienced both psychological and physical harassment throughout this time. They experienced a range of assaults and forms of discrimination. Asian Americans began to live in fear of their own homes and communities. However, the community's resilience and activism has led to increased public awareness and accountability for these acts of hate. Despite this progress, there are still many challenges to overcome, including making sure that victims of hate crimes have access to justice and support, combating ongoing stereotypes and prejudice against Asian Americans and their communities, and addressing systemic inequalities that contribute to the discrimination of minority communities.
The stigma of the Asian American community as a supposed cause of the virus's spread has led to a significant increase in hate crimes, from verbal harassment to physical assault. These incidents have had a significant impact on Asian American individuals and families, creating a climate of fear and anxiety. As soon as the court system recognized the severity of this issue, it began taking steps to assist in putting a stop to hate crimes committed against Asian Americans for good.
These are issues that predated COVID. If we look at Asian American history, Asian Americans, this notion of being racialized as Asians, that Asians have always sort of been seen as foreigners to the American nation, outsiders to the American nation, no matter what generation you are, right? And that has been basically legal cover for discrimination against Asian Americans, that they can never be fully American. So coming back to your questions, if you study Asian American history, one ways of studying is you look at all the laws that were passed, like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, but every group that came were subject to immigration restrictions solely based on their race. And the logic was that they could not become Americans, that they were a danger to American society, and they had to be kept out.
Law enforcement agencies have stepped up their efforts to look into and prosecute these incidents. Lawmakers have proposed steps to enhance the rules against hate crimes and inflict heavier punishments on those who commit such crimes. Here's when Biden signed the Anti-Asian Hate Crime Bill in 2021. The Asian American community has been taking action to combat hate and discrimination against their community through various methods. They have been using social media to raise awareness about the issue, sharing stories, and using hashtags to amplify their message. Protests have been held across the United States to demand action from lawmakers and law enforcement. Advocacy organizations have been pushing for policy changes such as increased hate crime legislation and funding for community-based organizations to support victims and prevent hate crimes. Support is also being provided to victims and their families through emotional, legal, and financial assistance. Education and outreach efforts are being made to combat stereotypes and misconceptions about Asian Americans through cultural education and sensitivity training. The Asian American community's efforts to address hate and discrimination demonstrate their commitment to promoting a more inclusive society for all.
Every time we're silent, every time we let hate flourish, we make a lie of who we are as a nation. I mean it literally. We cannot let the very foundation of this country continue to be eaten away like it has been in other moments in our history and happening again. I looked at this law that you all passed as maybe the first break, the first significant break on a moment in our history that has to be turned around. Not Democrat, Republican, has to be turned around. As a consequence, we should do what is required by the obligations of this democracy, by our faith in God and our faith in each other, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly, and as fellow human beings and fellow Americans, remember, we're unique in all of history as a nation. This is the United States of America, for God's sake.
Although a lot of progress has been made in addressing hate crimes against Asian Americans, there is still much work to be done.